The comm line was still open when the last voice from Colony Station Kepler 7 cut out. Not static, not interference, just silence, the kind that lands on you like a wall, the kind that tells you before your brain processes the data that something is gone and it is not coming back. I was already standing when my aide, a young man named Oliver, read out the casualty figure, 41,212. He read it twice because he thought he had made a mistake. He had not. I told him to sit down. He did not sit. Neither did I. That was 3 weeks ago. Now I am standing in a corridor aboard the Galactic Council flagship, and it is the most beautiful structure I have ever seen in my life, and I hate every centimeter of it. My name is Yara Osai. 6 months ago I commanded a deep space patrol division out of Earth's Third Fleet. I am not a diplomat. I have never wanted to be a diplomat. I was chosen for this post because Earth's actual diplomatic corps had spent 14 hours arguing about what tone to take with the Galactic Council, and at some point someone on the Prime Council looked around the room, looked at the clock, looked at me standing in the corner drinking cold coffee and said, "Os, you are going." I said, "I'm military." They said, "Exactly." So here I am. The Council flagship is called the Eternal Deliberation, which should tell you everything you need to know about the people who named it. It is 3 kilometers long. It has 17 decks dedicated entirely to meeting chambers. There are species aboard this ship that have been in active diplomatic session for longer than human civilization has been writing things down. The Thalori, for example, the tall amphibious delegates with the dark gold eyes and the habit of speaking in formal verse, have been engaged in a border mediation with another species called the Orivian since before Newton published his laws of motion. They are still mediating. Everyone on this ship speaks in layers. Every word carries a secondary meaning. Every silence is a message. Every gesture is a registered diplomatic signal with centuries of precedent behind it. The Council's etiquette manual runs to 40 volumes, none of which I have read, all of which Oliver has flagged and color-coded for me on a datapad that I left in my quarters on purpose. I have read one thing instead. The names, all 41,212 of them. I read them on the transit flight here. It took 11 hours. Oliver sat across from me and did not say a word. He is 23 years old from a city called Abuja, and he has the kind of quiet intelligence that makes you glad someone put him in the room with you. He read along with me silently until the list was finished. Then he closed his datapad, looked out the window at the stars and said, "I think they are going to expect us to apologize." I said, "I know." He said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "We are going to go in there and tell the truth." He nodded slowly, "And if the truth makes them angry, then they are already the wrong kind of people." The council chamber itself seats 240 delegates across concentric arcs of raised platforms. The design is intentional. Every species looks slightly down at every other species. Everyone is equal in their slight elevation. The center floor is open, circular, smooth white stone, and that is where you stand when you address the council. It is called the speaking circle, and based on the placard installed at its edge, it has been in continuous use for 430 years. I stepped into it for the first time that morning and felt the weight of the room the way you feel a change in atmospheric pressure, something physical, something that lands in your chest and stays there. The chamber was already full. Every arc was occupied. 40 species represented, some in environmental suits, some in atmospheric bubbles, some in forms so different from human that I had to remind myself that the being who looked like a slow, rotating cloud of dark mist near the back left platform was, in fact, a person with opinions and a vote. At the front arc, directly opposite me, sat the Velkari delegation. I had seen images. Images did not prepare me. The Velkari are large, not intimidating in the dramatic sense you might imagine, not covered in armor plating or radiating menace. They are simply large in the way that something engineered over millions of years to survive a harsh world is large. Their lead delegate, the one called HFY, sat with the kind of absolute stillness that predators use, not because he was waiting to act, because he had already decided that nothing in this room required his full attention. He had not looked at me since I entered. I looked at him the entire time. The council's chief session moderator, a Thalori elder whose name translated loosely into something like voice of the long record, opened the session with 12 minutes of formal procedural language that Oliver had told me was largely ceremonial and could be safely tuned out. I did not tune it out. I listened to every word, not because it mattered, but because I wanted to know exactly what kind of language this institution used when it was being comfortable. It used the language of management, of systems, of processes and frameworks and established channels. The 41,000 were not mentioned. The 2 colony stations were referenced once briefly as the Kepler incidents. Incident, singular event category, a thing that happened that now requires a procedure. Then the moderator introduced the agenda. Item 1, Territorial Boundary Disputes Kepler Sector. Item 2, Velkari Petition for Formal Recognition of Expanded Buffer Zone. Item 3, Earth Delegation Response to Velkari Position Paper. Not Earth's Presentation of Evidence. Not Investigation into the Destruction of 2 Inhabited Human Installations. Earth's Response, as if we had been the ones who needed to explain ourselves. A council clerk moved to the edge of the speaking circle and extended a small silver tray toward me. On it was a folded document. He said, in perfect English, because the translation systems here are extraordinary, the Council has prepared a statement of position for the Earth delegation, per standard protocol for newly joined species in their first formal dispute. You may read it as written or adapt it as you see fit. I picked up the document. I unfolded it. It was 4 paragraphs long. The first paragraph acknowledged the Velkari's territorial concerns as legitimate. The second expressed Earth's regret for any misunderstanding that had led to the Kepler incidents. The third requested a joint commission to review boundary placements. The fourth thanked the Council for its guidance. I read it once. I folded it back up. I handed it back to the clerk. He looked at the document. He looked at me. He said, carefully, Commander Osai, this document was prepared to help facilitate a productive opening to the session. I said, I understand, thank you. He said, will you be using it? I said no. There was a pause. He stepped back. I turned to face the full arc of the chamber, the cloud being, the amphibious Thalori, the cold and perfectly still Sen collective representatives, the Velkari, all of them, 240 delegates from 40 civilizations, the oldest of which had been crossing stars before humanity had figured out the wheel. I said, before this session begins its formal agenda, I would like to enter into the record the names of the people who were present on Kepler stations 4 and 7 on the date of what this council is calling the Kepler incidents. The moderator said, Commander, that is not standard procedure for an opening statement. I said, I am aware. I am asking for permission to enter the record. There was a pause. Under council rules, any delegation could submit materials to the session record. Technically, the moderator could not refuse. He knew it. I knew it. The room knew it. He said, the request is noted. You may proceed. I reached into the inside pocket of my gray field jacket and produced a single data chip. I held it up so the room could see it. Then I walked to the session record terminal at the edge of the circle and inserted it. I said 41,212 names. Each one is a person who was alive on the morning of the Kepler incident. Each one had a name given to them by someone who loved them. Each one is now gone. This record is now part of this session's formal archive. It cannot be removed. It will exist in council history alongside every procedural document, every vote, and every decision made in this room today. I stepped back to the center of the circle. I said, "Now we may begin." The chamber was quiet. Not the polite quiet of a room waiting for the next item on an agenda. A different kind of quiet. The kind that happens when something unexpected occurs in a place that has not experienced anything unexpected in a very long time. The 430-year-old speaking circle had probably heard 10,000 opening statements. Smooth, careful, measured words from species who knew the rules and played by them. It had not heard that before. The cloud being near the back left rotated slowly. The Thalori elder who had urged process and patience in the precession brief now sat with both of his long hands folded flat on the desk in front of him, watching me with his dark gold eyes. The Sen collective representatives, 3 of them, sitting in perfect identical posture, had each turned their heads at exactly the same angle. Shrethva, the Velkari delegate, had still not moved. But his eyes were on me now. Oliver, seated in the observer gallery behind me, sent a single message to my wrist display. I glanced down. It said, "They are listening." Yes, I thought they are. Good. Because I am just getting started. The Velkari's formal position paper was 47 pages long and had been submitted to the council 6 weeks before we arrived. I had read it. Oliver had read it. Our 2 remaining staff members, a navigation specialist named Lucy and a systems analyst named Patrick, had both read it. And what all 4 of us had noticed, independently, within the first 10 pages, was that the Velkari's entire legal argument rested on a single claim: that Kepler sector had been designated a protected expansion buffer under Council Charter, and that humanity's colonization of that space had constituted an act of territorial provocation. The word provocation appeared 14 times in 47 pages. The names of the dead appeared 0 times. Shrethva delivered the Velkari's opening oral statement in a language called Vel Prime, which the translation systems rendered in a flat, precise English with no emotional inflection, which honestly suited him perfectly. He spoke for 22 minutes. He cited precedent. He cited charter articles. He cited 3 other cases in council history where buffer zone violations had led to corrective responses, and the council had upheld the responding party's right to act. He never said what those corrective responses had involved, what had been corrected, who had been inside the thing that got corrected. When he finished, he sat back in his seat with the ease of someone who had done this before and expected it to work the same way it always had. The moderator turned to me. "The Earth delegation may respond." I stood. I said, "I would like to show the council something." I activated the chamber's central display, which filled the open air above the speaking circle with a 3-dimensional projection. I had loaded it myself the night before, not through the council's systems, but through our own portable projection unit, which Lucy had spent 4 hours getting approved for use in the chamber on the technical grounds that it was a standard navigational display device. What appeared in the air above the speaking circle was not a map. It was a recording. The final 17 minutes of Kepler Station 4's emergency broadcast, taken from the station's own sensor log and communication archive. I said, "The Council's protocol notes that raw sensory recordings are not standard evidentiary material in formal sessions. I am not submitting this as evidence. I am submitting it as context. Under Article 44 of the Session Charter, any delegation may provide contextual material to assist the Council's understanding of a situation. I am assisting the Council's understanding." The moderator looked at the charter text on his display. He looked at me. He said, "Proceed." What followed was 17 minutes that I had watched 11 times on the transit flight here, and could not watch without the same thing happening in my chest each time. You heard the station first. Normal operational sounds, a shift change announcement, someone laughing in a corridor somewhere near the microphone, then the proximity alarm, Then voices, fast and overlapping because the people on that station were professionals and they were already moving to their emergency positions. Then the impact. Not an explosion as you might imagine from a dramatic film, not a roar. A pressure wave, a structural groan, and then the sound of air going somewhere it was not supposed to go. Then voices again, calling names, calling for status reports. A woman named June, her voice completely steady, reading damage assessments into the log because that was her job and she was doing it right until the very end. A younger voice, a man named Callum, relaying power grid failures. Then static. Then silence. 17 minutes. The chamber was absolutely still. I let the silence last for 10 full seconds after the recording ended. Then I said, the 41,000 people whose names I entered into this record this morning were engaged in no military activity. Kepler Stations 4 and 7 were civilian deep space research and mining installations. The youngest person aboard was 11 years old. Her name was Penny. She was the daughter of a geologist named Frank, who is also on the list. I paused. I said, the Valkyrie delegation has used the word provocation 14 times in their position paper. I counted. I would like to ask the council what provocation Penny committed that justified the corrective response. Shrethva's stillness had changed quality. It was no longer the stillness of disinterest. It was the stillness of calculation, of someone revising their read of the situation in real time. The Thalori elder, Councillor Orris, was the first to speak from the delegate arcs. He said, in his slow, formal way, the Earth delegation's contextual submission is noted. The Council expresses its sympathy for the lives lost in the Kepler incidents. I said, thank you, Councillor. I would like to be clear that we are not here for sympathy. He paused. What are you here for? I said, accountability. A murmur moved through the chamber, not a loud one. In a room of 240 alien delegates, a murmur sounds like pressure, like weather, like the atmosphere itself shifting its weight around. The session broke for a procedural recess at that point. Standard practice, scheduled in advance, nothing to do with me. Oliver appeared at my side as the delegates moved to their private corridors and said, quietly, Shrethva looked at you for the entire recording. I said, I know. He said, is that good? I said, it means he is taking us seriously now. Oliver considered this, and before, I said, we were a procedural inconvenience, a newly joined species who had wandered into claimed space and needed to be processed and sent home with paperwork. And now, I looked across the emptying chamber, toward the Valkyrie delegation's exit corridor. Now we are a problem he has to solve. During the recess, Councillor Orris found me in the eastern corridor, near a long window that looked out at a star field so dense it looked like spilled light. He was older than any human being I had ever stood next to. 230 years on the council, they had told me. He moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned that every motion costs something. He said, Commander Osai, you have made an impression. I said, I was trying to make a record. He smiled, a Thalori expression that looks like a slow blink rather than a lifted mouth. In this place, those are the same thing. He stood beside me and looked at the stars. I want to help you. I want you to understand that. And because I want to help you, I need to tell you something that may be difficult to hear. I said, go ahead. This council has existed for 430 years, he said. In that time, we have managed 1,142 territorial disputes. Of those, 903 were resolved through mediated settlement. The remaining 239 were resolved through what we call facilitated withdrawal, which means one party agreed to step back from their position in exchange for something of value. We have done this 1,142 times. And the parties who stepped back, I said, how did they fare long term? He was quiet for a moment. The Council's purpose is to prevent catastrophic conflict. That is not what I asked. Another pause. The council has not always served every member equally well. That is a truth I carry. He turned to look at me. But you are new here. You do not yet understand the weight of the forces arranged against you. The Velkari are not merely a species with a legal argument. They are a permanent fixture of this council's power structure. They have allies here who will not reveal themselves openly. They work through process, through delay, through the slow machinery of bureaucracy. I said, so do we. Commander. Counselor Oris, I said, I hear what you are telling me. I understand the risk. But if I walk out of this chamber with a settlement and a withdrawal and a thank you for your patience document, then 41,000 people died because Earth made a paperwork error. And that is not something I am willing to write. Not in this record, not in any record. He looked at me for a long time. His gold eyes were very still. He said, you know they may try to remove you from the proceedings entirely. The Velkari have enough influence to motion for your credentials to be reviewed. I said, let them try. He said, and if it comes to something worse than a motion. I said, Counselor, I spent 16 years in Deep Space Patrol. Worse than a motion is where I live. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, I will not obstruct you. I said, I am not asking you to help me. He said, I know. That is why I will. He left before I could respond. I stood at the window and looked at the stars and thought about Penny, 11 years old, daughter of a geologist named Frank, and I thought about what it meant that she had never had the chance to grow up and see how beautiful and terrible the universe actually was. Then I went back inside. The council had moved to item 2 on the agenda, the Velkari's petition for expanded buffer recognition. The vote, if it passed, would retroactively legalize the Kepler corrective response under Council Charter. It would mean that what had happened to Kepler 4 and 7 was not a violation of anything. It was simply the adjustment of a line on a map. When the moderator opened the floor for responses to the petition, I was already standing. The moderator said, Earth delegation. I said, we do not negotiate with murderers. The chamber went very, very quiet. The kind of quiet that happens when something is said aloud that everyone knew was in the room, but no one had been willing to name. I heard Oliver behind me exhale very slowly. Shrethva, for the first time, leaned forward in his seat. The moderator said, carefully, Commander Osai, the council would ask that language be kept to the standards of formal diplomatic session. I said, the council's standards of diplomatic language are what allowed Kepler stations 4 and 7 to be destroyed while this body was in session 3 weeks away. I am not here to meet the standard. I am here to raise it. No one spoke for nearly 8 seconds. In a room with 240 beings, 8 seconds of absolute silence is a physical thing. Then the Sen Collective's lead representative, the one in the center of their 3-person block, raised one hand in the council signal for a point of clarification. The moderator acknowledged them. The Sen Collective representative said, in their precise, affectless voice, the Earth delegation's formal objection to the Velkari petition is noted and will be entered into the session record. The Sen Collective formally seconds the objection. The chamber shifted again, a second murmur heavier than the first. The Velkari had not expected that. The Sen Collective never spoke during open session. They communicated through written submissions. In 11 years of recorded sessions, they had never verbally seconded a motion. They had seconded mine. I did not let my expression change. I said, the Earth delegation thanks the Sen Collective. I sat down. Oliver leaned toward me and said, very quietly, what just happened? I said, the council just got complicated. He thought about that. Is that good for us? I said, complicated is the only thing we have ever been good at. And that, I knew, was the moment this stopped being a procedure and started being a fight. I did not smile. But I thought about Penny and Frank and June and Callum and all 41,212 names, and I thought, we are not done. We are nowhere close to done. This council had been quiet for 400 years. It would not be quiet today. What no one in that chamber knew yet, what only Oliver and I knew, was that the Sen Collective had not seconded our objection out of sympathy or solidarity. They had done it because they had evidence. 2 nights before the formal session opened, a small data chip had been left on the desk in my quarters aboard the Eternal Deliberation. There was no note with it, no sender identification, just the chip, sitting in the center of my desk when I returned from the pre-session observer briefing, placed with the kind of deliberate precision that says this was not an accident. I had Oliver run it through 3 separate security checks before we opened it. What it contained was a compressed archive of council records, internal records, not the public session transcripts, not the voting histories, not any of the documents that were theoretically accessible to any member species. These were administrative records, correspondence between Velkari Council liaisons and Council Charter Management officers, financial transaction logs, requests for archive amendments. Going back 40 years. And buried in those 40 years of paper, hidden in the dry language of bureaucratic maintenance, was something that made my breath stop for a moment when I read it. The Velkari's buffer zone had not always existed. It had been created. 41 years ago, a Velkari administrative officer had submitted a charter amendment request to the Council's Boundary Management Division. The request had cited a council precedent from 200 years prior about protecting developing species from territorial encroachment by more advanced civilizations. It was a reasonable-sounding precedent, a protective one, even. And using it as a justification, the Velkari had gotten a series of boundary designations added to the Council's official territorial chart. Small additions each time, a sector here, a zone there. Over 40 years, they had quietly drawn a large buffer around a significant portion of the outer arm of the galaxy. The same outer arm where humanity had begun building its first deep space colonies. We had not known the buffer existed because no one had told us. There was no announcement, no formal notification to newly joining species. The buffer was simply in the records in the chart updates filed away in the administrative archive, and if you did not know to look for it, you would never find it. And the Kepler sector, the space where our stations had been built, sat squarely inside it. The Velkari had not discovered us violating a boundary. They had drawn the boundary around us after we were already there. I read through the archive twice. I had Oliver read it independently, without telling him what to look for. He reached the same conclusion I had in under 2 hours. Then I had Lucy go through the original charter precedent the Velkari had cited in their amendment request, the 200-year-old boundary protection rule. She called me from her workstation at midnight and said, in a very flat voice that told me she was working hard to stay calm, "Yara, this precedent, the one they used." I said, "What about it?" She said, "It does not say what they claimed it says. It is about protecting per-contact species from being interfered with. It has nothing to do with buffer zones or territorial control. They just cited it and nobody checked." I said, "Because nobody thought to check." She said, "For 40 years nobody checked." I said, "Because in 40 years nobody challenged them." Long silence on the line. Then Lucy said, "What do we do with this?" I said, "We file it, formally, through the Council's legal review body. Under Article 79, any delegation can petition for a formal audit of records that may affect their status as a member species." She said, "And if the Velkari try to stop the audit?" I said, "They can try. But once the petition is filed, the legal review body is required under the Charter to freeze any active proceedings that touch the subject of the audit. Which means the buffer zone petition, and any action against us that relies on the buffer zone claim goes on hold." Another pause. Lucy said, "That buys us time." I said, "And it puts the record where no one can quietly erase it." She said, "They are going to know it was us." I said, "I know." So that was the shape of things when I walked back into the chamber on the morning of day 3, carrying the audit petition in a sealed document format submitted through the council's own secure filing system at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before the session opened. Oliver had confirmed receipt. The legal review body's automated acknowledgement was in our system within 30 minutes. The freeze protocol had activated. I did not announce any of this when the session opened. I waited. The moderator worked through morning procedural items, routine updates, attendance confirmations. Then he paused, looked at his display, and said, in a tone that suggested something had interrupted his script, "The Council Legal Review Body has transmitted a notification. An audit petition has been filed under Article 79, pertaining to territorial boundary designations in the Kepler sector and related charter records. Pending review, all proceedings relating to the Valkyrie buffer zone petition are placed in procedural hold." The chamber processed this slowly. Then it processed it faster. The Valkyrie side of the arc was very still, but it was a different stillness now, not the stillness of control, the stillness of something that had not expected the ground to move and was recalibrating its balance. Shrethva turned and looked at me, directly, clearly, the first time he had done so openly since the session began. I looked back. In the observer gallery, a delegate from a species called the Moravi, small pale beings who had been present at every session, but had never spoken or voted in any recorded proceeding in the last 50 years, leaned toward one another and exchanged a series of rapid gestures that their species used for communication. Counselor Oris sat perfectly still, but his hands, which had been flat on his desk since the session opened, had moved. They were now folded together, and there was something in the set of his long face that might, in a Thalori, have been something like the early stages of relief. The Sen Collective's 3 representatives each turned their heads at the same angle. They had turned them when I entered the names into the record on day 1. And then, from the Moravi section, something happened that Oliver told me afterward he would remember for the rest of his life. One of the small pale delegates stood up. They had never stood up in a session, ever, and they raised a hand in the council signal for a formal request to address the chamber. The moderator, visibly unsettled, acknowledged them. The Moravi delegate said, in a very quiet voice, "The Moravi delegation would like to submit a supplementary document to the legal review body's audit. We have held this document for 9 years. We have been waiting for a moment when submitting it would not endanger our status here. We believe that moment has arrived." They sat back down. The chamber erupted. Not in noise, in motion, delegates consulting their displays, aides moving between arcs, the cloud being rotating faster than it had at any point in 3 days of sessions. 3 other species, including one I had not yet identified, immediately submitted their own signals for the floor. Oliver sent me a message. "What did we just do?" I sent back. "We asked a question nobody was allowed to ask, and it turns out a lot of people had answers they had been keeping quiet." I stood in the speaking circle, and I looked around the chamber at 240 delegates from 40 civilizations, the oldest of whom had been navigating this galaxy since before my species built its first city, and I thought about what Counselor Oris had said, that the council had not always served every member equally well. That was a gentle way of saying that the Valkyrie had used this institution as a shield for a very long time, and that the institution had let them, because the institution valued its own continuity more than the truth it was supposed to protect. But the truth was a stubborn thing. You could bury it in 40 years of administrative amendments and charter updates and procedural language. You could count on the fact that nobody new enough to challenge you would understand the system well enough to know where to look. You could count on the weight of precedent and the exhaustion of process to keep the record exactly the way you needed it to stay. But all it took was one species that did not know the rules well enough to be afraid of breaking them. All it took was someone who read the names. All 41,212 of them. HFY was looking at me. He had been looking at me for 3 minutes straight, which for a Valkyrie in session was an extraordinary display of focused attention. I met his eyes and I did not look away, and I thought, you drew a line around us. You thought we would not notice. You thought we would come in here and read the statement your clerk prepared and go home. We noticed, and we are not going home. The morning session broke for recess. I did not move from the speaking circle for 90 seconds after the other delegates began to leave, standing in the center of 430 years of history, in a circle that had heard 10,000 careful words from 1,000 careful species. Then I walked out. Outside in the corridor, a being I had never spoken to fell into step beside me. It was one of the Moravi, barely shoulder height, pale enough to seem made of paper. It said quietly without looking at me, 41 years ago, the Valkyrie drew a boundary through the center of our home system and called it a transit corridor. We voted to accept their designation because we were told it was standard. We have been paying a transit fee for 41 years to cross the space our own cities were built in. It walked beside me. It said we did not know anyone would ever open those records. I said I did not know they were there. I was just looking for the truth about what happened to my people. It said sometimes those are the same search. It left me at the corridor junction without another word, and I stood for a moment in the quiet of the flagship's interior, and I thought about 41 years of a small pale species paying a fee to exist in their own sky, and I thought about June reading damage reports in a steady voice, until there was no more voice to read with. And I thought about what it meant to stand in a room full of people who had learned to survive by staying silent. Someone had to be loud enough to remind them they still had a voice. We were loud. We were going to keep being loud. The question now was whether the council's machinery would hold together long enough for the truth to reach a verdict, or whether the Valkyrie would find a way to shut the doors before the light got in. They were going to try. I knew they were going to try. I had brought Oliver with me, and Lucy and Patrick and 41,000 names, and one very important data chip. I did not think it would be enough to survive what came next. I thought it would be enough to make sure that whatever happened next could not be buried. That would have to be enough. For now, that would have to be enough. Oliver was in the medical bay when I arrived. He was sitting up. He had been moved from the critical monitoring unit to a recovery bed 18 hours after they found him. The ship's medical system, which handled about 12 species' biological needs on any given day, had taken 6 hours to properly calibrate a treatment for a human because the dosage protocols were based on theoretical xenobiology studies rather than actual clinical data. Our species had been in the galactic community for 60 years. In 60 years, nobody had bothered to update the medical database with real human physiological data. That was the kind of thing that reminded you, every single time, how young we were here. I sat in the chair beside his bed. He looked pale. He had a monitor line on his left wrist, and he was reading something on a handheld display, which was so perfectly Oliver that I almost said something about it, but my throat was not cooperating. He looked up and said, "You look terrible." I said, "Thank you." He said, "Did we lose?" I said, "No." He said, "Did we win?" I thought about that. We did not lose. That is different from winning. He considered this with the seriousness he gave everything. The Moravi spoke. "Yes. And the legal review is open." Yes. And the Velkari cannot proceed with the buffer zone petition while the audit runs. Correct. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So we have time." I said, "We have time." He said, "Good." Because while I was lying here, I was reading the Council's historical record of every audit petition filed under Article 79, and I found something I think you need to see. Of course he had. Of course he had been lying in a medical bed, recovering from a near-fatal poisoning, and reading Council legal history. I said, "How many audits have been filed under 79? He said, "In 430 years, 3. I said, "How were the other 2 resolved?" He said, "One was withdrawn by the filing delegation within 4 days. The other was dismissed by the legal review body on procedural grounds within a week." I looked at him. He said, "Nobody has ever successfully completed an audit under 79. The Velkari are going to move to have ours dismissed, probably today." I said, "On what grounds?" He said, "There are 7 possible procedural objections they can use. I have gone through all 7. He turned his display toward me. 5 of them are not applicable because of language we included in our filing. 2 of them might stick. Specifically, Article 79 requires that the filing delegation demonstrate a direct material impact on their member status. We argued Kepler was the impact. But the Velkari's lawyers are going to argue that Kepler has not been formally ruled a violation. Therefore, there is no demonstrated impact. Therefore, the audit has no standing." I said, "Circular logic. They are saying we cannot audit the thing that hurt us because the thing that hurt us has not been ruled harmful yet." He said, "Exactly." I said, "And the legal review body will accept that argument." He said, "Based on the historical record, probably yes, unless someone counters it with a different precedent." I said, "Is there a different precedent?" He said, "Actually, yes. It is buried in a case from 200 years ago. A species called the Larath filed an audit petition under a predecessor article to 79. They faced the same circular objection from the opposing party. The Council's legal review body ruled in the Larath's favor on the grounds that demonstrated intent to cause harm was sufficient standing even without a formal ruling on the harm itself." I said, "And what constitutes demonstrated intent?" He said, "The Larath produced communications showing that the opposing party had discussed the harm they intended to cause in internal correspondence before taking action." I looked at him. He looked at me. The data chip. The 40 years of internal Velkari administrative correspondence. The quiet discussions between council liaisons about how to place the buffer zone and how to use the precedent that said something different from what they claimed it said. I said, "We have the intent evidence." He said, "We have the intent evidence." I said, "Oliver." He said, "Yes." I said, "When you are well enough to walk, you are getting a commendation." He said, "I would rather have a working medical database, so the next time something like this happens, the ship system knows what a human being's blood chemistry is supposed to look like." I said, "I will put that in the resolution demands." He said I was joking. I said I was not. I submitted the Larath precedent filing to the Council's legal review body at midday, before the Velkari delegation had finished drafting their dismissal motion. When the Velkari's motion arrived at the legal review body 40 minutes later, it was reviewed against our filing simultaneously. The legal review body's preliminary assessment, transmitted to all parties 3 hours after that, cited the Larath case directly. The audit would proceed. In the chamber for the afternoon session, the moderator read the legal review body's decision aloud. 17 species, and I had counted them 17, stood at exactly the same moment. Under council protocol, standing during a session announcement was a signal of formal alignment. It was not a vote. It was a declaration. We stand with this. We stand with what this means. I had not asked any of them to stand. I had not spoken to most of them. We had not built alliances or made deals or traded favors. There had been no diplomatic groundwork. We had simply walked into a room and told the truth and refused to stop telling it. And 17 species who had been sitting quietly in this chamber for years and decades, and in some cases centuries, had stood up because something true had finally been said in a place that had learned to survive on managed untruths. I looked at them, all 17. Then I looked at HFY. He was looking at me, and for the first time since this session began, I saw something in his expression that was not calculation, not stillness, not the managed performance of someone who had done this before and expected to do it again. He looked for just a moment, like someone who had realized the ground had been shifting under them for 3 days and had only just now felt it move. Counselor Oris had told me on the first night that the Velkari were a permanent fixture of this council's power structure. I thought fixtures can be removed. You just have to find the right tool. Ours had been simple: a data chip, a legal precedent 200 years old, a young man in a medical bed reading council history on a handheld display, 41,000 names entered into an archive that could never be erased. The moderator asked if there were any further procedural items before the session concluded for the day. I stood. I said, the Earth delegation requests that the Council's member species medical database be updated to include accurate human physiological data within 60 days of this session's conclusion. It is a safety matter that affects our delegation staff directly. The moderator blinked. This was, by any measure, the smallest procedural request that had ever been made in the context of a session this significant. He said, the request is noted. I said, thank you. I sat down. Oliver, from his display in the medical bay, sent me a message. It said, you did not have to do that. I sent back, I told you I was not joking. 3 dots, then thank you. I put my display away. Outside the windows of the eternal deliberation, the stars were exactly where they had always been. They did not care about our session. They did not care about buffer zones or charter precedents or 41 years of quietly redrawn maps. They had been burning before any of us started keeping records, and they would burn long after the last archive faded. But we were here, right now, and what happened here would be in those archives. Every name, every filing, every moment when someone stood up and others stood with them. That mattered. It mattered because the universe was very large and very old and very indifferent. And in the face of all of that, all any of us could do was insist on the record. Insist on the names. Insist on the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient to people who had built their comfort on the assumption that no one would come looking for it. We had come looking. We were still here. And tomorrow we would be louder. The morning of the vote, I woke at 4 in the morning and could not go back to sleep. I lay on the narrow bunk in my quarters aboard the eternal deliberation and looked at the ceiling and listened to the ship systems, the low hum of the atmospheric regulators, the distant vibration of something in the engineering section 3 decks below, and I thought about Frank. I had not thought about Frank in a few days, not specifically, not as an individual out of the list. I had been thinking in aggregate, in mass, in the weight of all 41,000 together, which is what you do when the number is too large to hold in any other way. But this morning I thought about Frank specifically. A geologist, someone who had gone to the outer edges of explored space to study rocks and mineral formations on alien moons. Someone ordinary in the best possible way. Someone who had taken his 11-year-old daughter with him because maybe he thought it would be an adventure, or maybe there was no one at home to leave her with, or maybe she had asked to come and he could not say no. I thought about that, a father who could not say no. I got up. I made tea on the small unit in my quarters, which made adequate tea and nothing else well. I stood at the window and drank it and watched a distant star that was larger and older than our sun pulse slowly in the dark. Oliver had been discharged from the medical bay the afternoon before. He had walked into the observer gallery for the final hour of yesterday's session and sat down in his usual seat and pulled out his display and started taking notes as if he had not been unconscious 48 hours ago. And when I looked back at him from the speaking circle, he had given me a small nod that said everything was fine. I had looked away before I did something undignified. Lucy and Patrick had spent the last 3 days building our formal presentation for the vote. Not a legal argument, not a procedural motion, but a complete account. The 40-year history of the Valkyrie buffer zone construction, the falsified precedent, the financial records showing transit fees collected from the Moravi, the communications detailing the intent to create enforceable boundaries in space that other species were already occupying. All of it organized in clear, readable language because I had told them specifically. Write it so that any species, regardless of how long they have been in this chamber, can understand it in one reading. Lucy had said, "What if they do not want to understand it?" I had said, "That is what the record is for. You cannot unread something that is in the archive." The vote was not just on the Valkyrie's buffer zone petition. The legal review body, working faster than anyone had expected once the Moravi's supplementary documents arrived, had issued an extraordinary preliminary finding. Sufficient evidence existed to support a formal finding of record tampering. They were not the sentencing body. They could not issue sanctions, but their finding opened the floor for any council member to bring a motion for formal censure. Councillor Orris had sent me a written note the evening before. No salutation, no formal header, just a single line: "The motion will be tabled at the start of tomorrow's session." I expect it will not come from me. I had read it 3 times trying to understand what he meant. Then I understood. The motion would come from a species whose presence would carry more weight than Thalori authority, which was administrative and ancient. It would come from the Sen Collective, whose silence in sessions was so total that when they spoke, every other delegate listened. I had not asked them. They had moved independently. I thought about what the young Sen delegate had done back on day 1, seconding my objection without anyone requesting it, and I thought about the data chip on my desk that night with no sender identification, and I thought, the Sen Collective had been waiting. They had been waiting for someone to open the door from the other side. The session opened at 8. The Sen Collective tabled the censure motion at 8 minutes past. The chamber's response was immediate and total. Not chaos, not argument. The kind of absolute focused attention that happens when 240 intelligent beings realize simultaneously that they are watching something that will be in the record for as long as the record exists. The moderator called for a 2-hour deliberation period before the vote. Standard procedure for censure motions. Delegates returned to their arcs, and the chamber filled with the quiet sound of 240 beings consulting their displays and their aids and their own long memories of how this institution was supposed to work, and how it had actually been working, and what the difference meant. Shrethva requested a private recess with his delegation. The moderator granted 20 minutes. I did not move from the speaking circle during the recess. I stood there because it was the only place in the chamber that belonged to no one, the neutral ground, and I did not want to be anywhere that felt like territory right now. Oliver came to stand a few feet away and said, "Do you want water?" I said yes. He handed me a cup. I drank it. He stood quietly beside me. I said, "If this does not pass, we have still put everything in the record. Nothing we have filed can be erased. Whatever they vote today, the truth is in the archive." He said, "I know." I said, "I want you to know that before the vote happens. Whatever comes next, what we did here matters. The Morevi walked out of here with 41 years of their own story finally accounted for. That happened regardless of how they vote. He said, I know that too. I said, are you frightened? He said, yes. I said, good, that means you understand what it means. He said, were you frightened on the first day, when you read the names into the record? I thought about that. I said, I was not frightened. I was certain. That is different. I was certain that whatever happened after, the names would be in the record, and nothing frightens me once I have done the one thing I know was right. He nodded slowly. I think that is the bravest thing I have ever heard. I said, it is not bravery, it is just arithmetic. You decide what matters. You do what it takes to protect that thing. The rest is just detail. He said, you make it sound simple. I said, it is simple. It is the hardest simple thing there is. The Velkhari returned from their recess. Shrethva walked back to his seat and sat down and looked at the center of the chamber and did not look at me, and I understood from that, the pointed not looking, that something had shifted in the calculation. I did not know what. I would not know until it happened. The moderator called the deliberation period to an end and opened the floor for final statements before the vote. Shrethva stood. The chamber went absolutely still. He spoke for 4 minutes, in Vel Prime, which the translation system rendered in that same flat, precise English. He cited the charter. He cited the Velkhari's long record of contributions to council stability. He cited 300 years of managed peace in the Outer Arm. He did not deny the record tampering. He did not address the Morevi transit fees. He did not say the names of any of the 41,000. What he said in the last 30 seconds of his statement was this: the Velkhari have been architects of order in a galaxy that trends toward chaos. What this council calls tampering, we call management. What this council calls a violation, we call maintenance. The Outer Arm is stable because we have maintained it. That stability has a cost. We have borne that cost. This council has benefited from that cost without asking what it was. He sat down. I stood up. I said, order maintained by building walls around other people's homes is not order. It is occupation with better paperwork. And peace that depends on the silence of the people it is keeping peace over is not peace. It is the sound of someone holding their breath and waiting. I paused. I said, this council is 430 years old. In those years it has mediated 1,142 disputes and called that a record of stability. I want to ask the council, stable for whom? Managed for whose benefit? I am 60 years a member of this institution. I did not know this institution's rules when I arrived. I did not know its language or its precedents or its etiquette or its 40 volumes of protocol. What I knew was 41,000 names. And I have learned in the 3 weeks since I arrived in this chamber that knowing the names is the oldest rule there is. Everything else is a footnote. I sat down. The moderator called the vote. 240 delegates, 40 species, 430 years of history in the room with all of us. The vote took 7 minutes because of the translation and verification protocols. When it came back, the moderator read it in a steady voice. 31 in favor of censure, 6 opposed, 11 abstentions. The Velkhari were to be stripped of 3 council seats. The buffer zone designation was voided. The Kepler sector was declared sovereign human territory under standard new member protections. A formal investigation into all boundary designations filed by the Velkhari in the past 60 years was opened. And at the bottom of the resolution, in formal council language, a line that Councillor Ores had apparently drafted himself and submitted to the legal review body the previous evening for inclusion. The names entered into session record by the Earth delegation on the opening day of these proceedings are hereby recognized as the formal basis of record for all findings and actions taken in this matter. The Kepler dead are not an incident. They are a foundation. The chamber did not erupt. It did not cheer or celebrate. 240 alien beings do not respond to a historic vote the way a human crowd would. What happened was subtler and, I think, more significant. They turned toward each other. Species that had not spoken directly across arcs in years began passing messages. The Moravi, all of them, rose slowly to their feet, not in the formal alignment signal, but in something that looked, across the barrier of biology and culture and millions of years of separate evolution, like relief. Like something put down after a very long time of being carried. Shrethva rose from his seat. He took one long look at the center of the speaking circle, at me standing in it, and then he turned and walked out of the chamber without looking back. The door closed behind him. Nobody filled his seat. Oliver was beside me when I turned around. He looked, for the first time since Kepler, like he did not have to hold something heavy. I said, "Go call home." He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "I am going to stay here for a few minutes." He nodded and left. I stood in the speaking circle alone. The chamber was still filling with the quiet sounds of 240 beings processing the moment. And in the middle of all of it I stood on 430 years of worn white stone and thought about the obvious thing. The thing you think about when something very large is over and the room is still around you. I thought about June, reading damage reports in a steady voice until there was no more voice, doing her job right until the end. I thought about Callum relaying power grid failures, doing his. I thought about Frank, who could not say no. I thought about Penny, 11 years old, who had never had the chance to stand in a room like this and see how complicated and strange and salvageable the universe actually was. I stood there for a long time. Then I walked out of the chamber, down the corridor, past the long window where Counselor Oris and I had talked on the first night, and I found a quiet corner of the observation deck, and I called Earth. It was early morning in Nairobi, where the Prime Council met. The session director, a woman named Helen, answered on the second ring. She had clearly not slept. She said, "Oh, Sai." I said, "It is done." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The full resolution." I said, "All of it. The censure passed. The buffer zone is voided. The Kepler sector is ours. The investigation into Velkari boundary filings is open." A longer pause. In the background I could hear someone else in the room with her, and then movement, and then a sound I could not fully parse from 60 light-years away, but which sounded, faintly, like people beginning to understand that something had happened. Helen said, "How?" I said, "We read the names." She said, "Yara." I said, "The names, Helen, we read the names, that is all it took." The line was quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Come home." I looked out at the stars. The same stars that had been burning for 1 billion years before Penny was born and would be burning for 1 billion more after all of us were gone. The same indifferent, beautiful, endless dark that Frank had brought his daughter out into because some part of him had wanted her to see it. I said, "I will." I stayed at the window a moment longer. Then I turned and went to find Oliver and Lucy and Patrick, and I told them to start packing. We had a rust bucket freighter to catch. We were going home. I gave one statement to the press when we landed. I was tired. I had not slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in 3 weeks. My field jacket had a small burn mark on the left sleeve from a heating element in my quarters aboard the eternal deliberation that had malfunctioned during week 2, and that I had never gotten around to fixing. I stood at the podium in the arrival terminal at Nairobi Station and looked out at the cameras and the reporters and the crowd that had gathered because word had gotten ahead of us, as it always does, and I said, 41,212 people died in the Kepler sector. They were going about their lives. They were doing their jobs. Some of them were raising children in a place they had decided was worth the risk of the distance from home. We went to the Galactic Council to answer for that, not to apologize for it, to answer for it, to stand in the room where decisions get made and say the names of the people who could no longer say them for themselves. That is all we did. The rest followed. A reporter shouted, "Commander Osei, what happens now? The Velkari are still out there." I said, "Yes, they are, and so are we, and so are 17 other species who stood up when they did not have to. The galaxy did not get safer in 3 weeks. The galaxy got more honest. Those are different things. Honest is harder. Honest is also better." Another reporter, "Would you do it again?" I said, "We will do it again. Not because we want to, because someone will make it necessary, and when they do, we will go." I left the podium before anyone could ask a third question. Helen was waiting in the corridor behind the media area. She looked like she had aged 3 years in 3 weeks, which probably meant I looked the same. She said, "How are you?" I said, "I want to go to sleep and not think about council procedure for at least 30 days. She said, "You have 72 hours. Then we need to debrief on the Velkari investigation and the open audit cases." I said, "Of course I do." She said, "Yara." I said, "Yes." She said, "What you did in there. I want you to know that we understand what it cost." I looked at her. I thought about whether cost was the right word. In my experience, cost implied that you had weighed the options and chosen the expensive one. I had not weighed anything. I had walked in with 41,000 names, and the knowledge that those names were the only leverage that mattered, the only argument that could not be procedurally dismissed, the only thing that was truly non-negotiable, and everything else had followed from that. You cannot negotiate the existence of the dead. They existed. They are gone. That is the whole of the argument, and it is also the whole of the point. I said it did not feel like a cost. It felt like arithmetic. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once and let me go. I found a car waiting outside the terminal. Oliver was in the back seat, already asleep, which made me feel an unreasonable amount of affection for him. Lucy was in the front, talking to a friend on her personal comm, and she gave me a small wave when I got in. Patrick was sitting across from Oliver with a cup of coffee and an expression of someone who had processed a great deal and was not yet finished. I got in and closed the door, and the car began to move. Through the window, Nairobi was waking up. Early morning light on buildings I recognized, streets I had walked before the fleet, before the patrol years, before any of this. A city that did not know what had happened in a chamber 60 light years away, and did not yet fully understand how the world was about to become both more dangerous and more possible than it had been 3 weeks ago. A small child on the sidewalk was chasing a dog that was clearly not interested in being caught. They were both moving at full speed, and neither was going to stop. I watched them until they disappeared around a corner. Penny would have been old enough to chase dogs, old enough to argue with her father about bedtime, old enough to ask questions about the stars and expect real answers. I thought, we will answer for her. We will keep answering. That is not heroism. That is not strategy. That is just the oldest obligation there is. You do not leave your people behind. Not in the void between stars. Not in a council chamber. Not in a legal archive. Not in the silence that forms when a room full of powerful beings expects you to fold, and you simply do not fold. You stand in the circle. You say the names. You let the record speak. The car moved through the waking city, and I watched the light change on the buildings, and I thought about Frank, who had loved his daughter enough to bring her to the edge of everything, and about June, who had kept reading when reading was all she had left to do, and about the Moravi, paying fees to cross their own sky for 41 years, and about Counselor Oris, 230 years of careful management, sitting down beside me at the window and being, just for a moment, on the right side of the thing he had always known was wrong. And I thought about Oliver, asleep in the seat across from me with his display still clutched in one hand, already planning his next filing probably, his next precedent, his next footnote in the archive of a civilization that was 60 years old in a galaxy that was 14 billion years old and was only just beginning to understand what we were. We were the species that read the names. We were the species that came to the oldest room in the known world with a data chip and a rust bucket freighter and a field jacket with a burn mark on the sleeve and stood in the center of 430 years of managed silence and said, "Not here. Not these. Not on our watch." That was all. That was everything. The Galactic Council had fallen silent when we said it. And in that silence, finally, the truth had room to breathe.